During the Cold War, there were bombers built by both sides that were frighteningly competent at carrying out their terrifying missions. And then there were the bombers we're talking about today.
This is only a test. This is only a test.
Here are the rules. We're looking at strategic bombers that first flew between the end of World War II and the collapse of the Soviet Union. When ranking them, we'll be considering performance, safety, combat record where applicable, and how quickly they became obsolescent through changes in technology or doctrine. And, as always, these criticisms are of the planes, not of the crew who flew them, and who sometimes drank their coolant. At number 5, we're already cheating a little because it's a tie. The most advanced and powerful bomber that went into service in World War II was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Featuring innovations such as a pressurized crew area, making things a little more comfortable at high altitudes, and computer-assisted remote control gun turrets, the B-29's endurance and payload made it ideal for the Pacific theater. There were, of course, teething problems. The program cost more than the Manhattan Project, the gun system was ambitious and complicated, and the engines caught fire more often than would be ideal. But the B-29 was a success in the difficult Pacific theater towards the end of the war. And, of course, the B-29 is probably most associated with the nuclear devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the mid-1940s, the B-29 was the only aircraft in the American arsenal that was capable of dropping an atomic bomb. A British Lancaster had the payload capacity, but not the operating ceiling or speed to drop an atomic warhead with a good chance of surviving the resulting explosion. This was, in part, why the American government refused to allow the Soviet Union to have any B-29s, instead sending them medium bombers, such as the A-20 or the B-25. However, during raids in the Pacific theater, 4 B-29s either emergency landed or crashed in Soviet territory, and the Soviets held on to them. They held on to the American crews as well, and the story of how those crews managed to get back home again is probably worth its own video. The captured B-29s were repaired by the Soviets until they were airworthy, and then flown to an airfield outside of Moscow, where Soviet engineers pored over every square inch of them. Or, because they were Soviets, every square centimeter. And in June 1945, Stalin ordered the Tupolev Design Bureau to reverse engineer their own version of the B-29. If the Americans wouldn't give Stalin their new heavy bomber, he would just build a bootleg version. Stalin demanded an exact copy and gave a 2-year deadline to Tupolev. Stalin was infamously, notoriously, not a patient person who was willing to give anyone any leeway, so it must have been an exhausting and harrowing project to work on. Lavrenti Beria himself, the monstrous head of the Soviet secret police, was personally in charge of monitoring the progress of the program. Any delay or setback would likely have been seen as deliberate sabotage by the paranoid Beria. Andrei Tupolev himself had already seen the inside of a Soviet gulag in the late 1930s, and it's unlikely he would have been anxious to return to one. The Soviet engineers were unable to completely copy the B-29 for a reason that we just referenced. The Americans used imperial measurements for their aluminum thickness and screw and bolt sizes, while the Soviets used the metric system. There have been stories told about how these differences resulted in a Soviet copy that was absurdly heavy, but the truth is the Soviet version was close to the B-29 in weight. At the 1947 Toshino Aviation Day Parade, Western observers were surprised and alarmed to see what appeared to be 3 B-29s take part in the Soviet flyover. Any hopes that maybe the Soviets had simply rebuilt the captured American examples were dashed when the Tu-70 passenger airliner version of the B-29 appeared. Clearly, the Soviets had been successful in copying the B-29. There were Soviet engines on the wings and Soviet cannons in the turrets instead of American 50 caliber machine guns, but the Tupolev Tu-4 was fundamentally a faithful cover band version of the original B-29. And something of an engineering triumph, particularly when you consider the conditions that Tupolev and his people were working under. If the Tu-4 was a successful copy of the most capable bomber of the 1940s, why is it included on this list? It's because the 1940s came to an end, to be replaced by the 50s. Just like in the United States Air Force, the B-29 was replaced by the B-50. And the career of the B-50 explains why both it and the Tupolev version are at number 5. The Boeing B-50 was an updated version of the B-29. It used a stronger and lighter aluminum alloy and had more powerful engines. But it could be argued that it wasn't different enough to be given an entirely new designation. This was done for political purposes. By claiming it was a brand new bomber instead of just a variation of an older one, the Air Force could justify a larger amount of procurement funding for the project. But all of the sleight-of-hand money juggling couldn't change the fact that a World War II propeller bomber was about to enter the world of Cold War jet fighters. The B-50 was fast. It would have been extremely fast by World War II heavy bomber standards. It could fly at 37,000 feet at almost 400 miles an hour. However, the new MiG-15s, which the B-50 would have encountered in any kind of mission into the USSR, could fly at 15,000 meters at over 1,000 kilometers an hour. It could fly at 50,000 feet at over 650 miles an hour. The machine gun turrets of the B-50, even with a sophisticated computer assist, would have been insufficient to prevent the Soviet fighters from knocking the now obsolete bombers out of the sky. And in the Korean War, just a few years after the B-50 entered service, this was driven home when 16 B-29s and a reconnaissance version of a B-50 were shot down by MiG-15s. The age of prop-driven heavy bombers was over, except for the Tu-95, of course. Neither the American copy of the B-29 nor the Soviet copy of the B-29 would be able to survive long in the Cold War airspace, which is why they both come in at number 5. If those two bombers are on the list because they couldn't fly high enough, the next bomber comes in for not being able to fly low enough. The Avro Lancaster was another one of the most effective World War II bombers, as we said, and after the war, the British government tried to wring a little bit more out of it by developing the Avro Lincoln. However, the Lincoln, even more than the B-50, was clearly a design whose time had come and gone, although, amazingly, the Avro Shackleton Maritime Patrol version of the Lincoln wasn't retired until 1991. 3 British aircraft manufacturers pitched futuristic replacements for the new class of British heavy bombers. The Avro Vulcan was probably one of the most beautiful aircraft ever flown and had a long service life that lasted until the 1980s. The Handley Page Victor saw effective service as a tanker until the 1990s. And the Vickers Valiant comes in at number 4 on this list. The V bombers, called that because their names all started with V, were commissioned in 1947. Because the RAF was venturing into a very unknown area, it was decided to go through with all 3 of the bombers. The chances were at least one of them would be effective, and you don't need to worry about picking the wrong one to put into production. The Valiant was the least radical design of the 3. While the Vulcan had enormous delta wings, and the Victor had an unusual crescent wing, the Valiant had a conservative swept wing design and a conventional tailplane. This hesitation to innovate more than necessary was pushed as a benefit by Vickers, and the Valiant entered service in 1955, a year before the Vulcan and 2 years before the Victor. The mission was to fly high and fast to avoid fighter interception and carry nuclear warheads into the Soviet Union. The Valiant didn't have the speed or the service ceiling of the Vulcan or the Victor, but it was a reasonably safe and reliable aircraft. There were some crashes. Of the 107 Valiants built, 11 were lost, including the prototype. But for the most part, the Valiant did the job it was supposed to do. It even saw action in Operation Musketeer in the Suez Canal, in which there were no Victors shot down, although opposition was extremely light. However, in 1960, everything changed. Gary Powers was shot down in his Lockheed U-2 spy plane while he was flying over the Soviet Union at a height that the CIA had assumed would provide safety. The weapon that shot him down, an S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile, contributed to the changing of doctrine for British bombers. Height was no longer a guarantee of safety or success. Improvements in radar would make the bombers visible, and new missiles and interceptors, like the MiG-17, would make the bombers vulnerable. The answer was to drop to the ground, hugging the terrain and flying underneath the radar to avoid detection. But in 1964, a Valiant crew was flying a training mission when they experienced what they thought was a mid-air impact. In an impressive bit of flying, they were able to land the plane safely, but once on the ground it was obvious that one of the Valiant's large wings was drooping noticeably. It hadn't been an impact. It was the silent menace of metal fatigue. Other Valiants were inspected and their wing spars showed similar weaknesses. American bombers like the B-47 and the B-52 kept their engines in nacelles hanging below the wings. The British bombers kept their engines hidden away in the wing roots. This made for a more streamlined shape, but it also meant that the section of the wing that joined to the fuselage, a location that has to cope with tremendous stresses during flight, was weakened from the large spaces needed to fit the engines, as well as the vibrations from the engines themselves. The Vulcan had a massive wing that could diffuse the stress, and the placement of the Vickers engines meant that there was a more favorable load distribution. But when the Valiant's mission changed from high altitude, where the air is thin, to low altitude, where the air is thick and violent, the stresses were too much for the wing spars. Between the dangers of missiles and MiGs at high altitude and thick air at low altitude, there was nowhere left for the Valiant to fly, and the Valiant fleet was retired at the beginning of 1965. It wasn't a bad aircraft, but time caught up to it in more ways than one, as it does with all of us. Eventually, similar issues would be found with the Victors, and they would be switched over to being in-flight refueling tankers. After the retirement of the Vulcan in the mid-80s, the British got out of the heavy bomber game entirely, instead relying on submarine-launched missiles. Speaking of the British, during World War II, Great Britain was a staging ground for American B-17 and B-24 bombers, which didn't have the range to get to Germany from North America. However, had Britain fallen to Nazi occupation, the American bombers of the time would have been unable to reach into continental Europe. To address this possibility, in 1941, the United States Army Air Corps put out a call to manufacturers to design a heavy bomber that could fly at 40,000 feet and get from Newfoundland to Berlin and back with a full payload of bombs. By 1944, it was clear that Britain wasn't going to fall to the Germans, but the Americans still wanted to reach Tokyo from Hawaii, so the project continued. Consolidated, who were already making the long-legged B-24, took up the challenge and started designing an aircraft that could meet the qualifications. Before aerial refueling had become feasible, the only way to achieve that range was to build a plane that could store massive amounts of fuel. And that meant a massive plane, and that plane comes in at number 3 on our list. How big was it? Hilariously big. The Boeing B-29 was a large plane, but looked like a duckling next to its mom when it was beside the B-36. Designed with 6 pusher engines to reduce the impact of the propeller wash on the airflow over the wing, the B-36 emerged into the light of day for the first time in August 1945, and then blocked out the light of day when it took to the air the following year. By this time, the USAAC had become the USAAF, and then the USAF, and had consolidated with Vultee and had become Convair, so the new Convair B-36 was about to become the USAF's enormous hammer. And it was a hammer that didn't fit in most toolboxes. The B-36 was too large for many Air Force hangars, which meant doing maintenance, including changing the 56 spark plugs in each of the 6 propeller engines, outdoors, often in the Alaskan winter. The pusher layout also caused engine cooling difficulties, as they were not getting the benefit of constantly gulping cool, fresh air as they would in a conventional position in front of the wing. The maintenance crews did an extraordinary job to keep the massive and massively complicated B-36s flying, which was important in the late 1940s and early 50s when the aluminum overcast was the only American bomber capable of getting to Moscow with a nuclear warhead. However, while it had the range to get there, it's questionable as to whether it would have ever made it. Early B-36 variants flew slow, but higher than AA guns could shoot. At first, using World War II doctrines, the B-36 bristled with defensive turrets armed with cannons that would have made short work of any propeller-driven interceptors, even if they could have climbed up to the atmospheric penthouse that the B-36s would be lazily lounging in on their way to Moscow. Unfortunately, after the British provided the Soviets with the specs for their new jet engine, in the name of improved international cooperation, the Soviets quickly produced the cannon-armed MiG-15, which likely would have chewed up the large and slow B-36s like the world's most expensive clay pigeons. In addition, the same surface-to-air missiles that would eventually doom the Valiant would have made short work of a B-36 fleet at 40,000 feet. Measures were taken to try to make the B-36 mission more survivable. The B-36D added 4 jet engines, totaling 10 engines in all. The classic line was 6 turning and 4 burning. To save weight, most of the obsolete cannon installations were removed. But there were much more radical plans to try to allow the B-36 to operate in this new hostile environment. To deal with the interceptor problem, A tiny, tiny fighter was designed by McDonnell, the XF-85 Goblin. The Goblin pilot would have to spend most of the long flight suspended below the B-36 in his tiny, tiny cockpit. And then, as the bomber approached hostile airspace, the Goblin would detach and engage the hostile fighter planes in a dogfight. The bizarre docking arrangement was tested with the B-29, but it was simply too hazardous, almost claiming the life of a test pilot. And the little Goblin, while it was adorable, looking like a surprised silver egg, wouldn't have been able to match up to a proper jet fighter like a MiG-15. There was another parasite fighter attempt made with the B-36 using a reconnaissance RF-84K Thunderstreak. The B-36 would lumber close to enemy airspace, and then the RF-84 would detach for a high-speed photo shoot into hostile territory. Alternately, an F-84 could be outfitted with a small tactical nuclear bomb, and the B-36 could ferry it out to the battlefield. The U-2 made the reconnaissance project unnecessary, and common sense and testing difficulties ended the tactical bomb parasite project. Of course, the most radical experiment carried out with the B-36 was the NB-36H, with the N standing for nuclear. Both the Americans and the Soviets were interested in the concept of having a strategic bomber with a nuclear power plant, which would mean that it would have virtually unlimited fuel. A B-36 that had been damaged in a storm was used as the test bed, and it was modified with a protective lead and rubber crew capsule at the front of the plane and 10-inch thick crystal windows throughout. Then, a 1 megawatt air-cooled reactor was placed in the belly of the plane. In this test aircraft, the reactor never actually powered the engines, but the plane was flown with conventional fuel while the reactor was operating. Now, of course, I am not a nuclear physicist, and I have no expertise in the area of nuclear power plants. However, I was able to interview Dr. Shelly Lesher, professor and chair of physics at the North Carolina A&T State University, and I was able to ask her if putting a nuclear reactor in a bomber is a good idea.
No.
Then I figured while I had her on the line, I would ask a follow-up question. So what are some of the difficulties of trying to run a nuclear power plant in an airplane?
One, they're large. Two, you have to use lead and other materials to protect against radiation. Three, if there is a crash, then you have nuclear materials spread around a large section of land.
And in fact, there were some issues with bombers with nuclear weapons that went down.
Yes.
I would imagine a bomber with an active nuclear reactor might in some ways be worse than a bomber that crashes with a nuclear bomb.
I can guarantee it's worse. How we didn't blow ourselves up with all of the nuclear weapons that went down is beyond me.
Yeah, because some were just dropping by accident. Sometimes planes went down. Like, there was a lot of crashed atomic bombs.
Yes. And one that's still in the ground in North Carolina.
That's right, somewhere.
Yes, which I think we should go find.
Yeah, we'll get some Geiger counters and some swamp boots.
Good idea. Good idea. But if you have a reactor, it's not self-contained like a nuclear weapon is. It's going to crash and the fuel rods are going to go everywhere. So it's going to be more like, I mean, it's not going to explode like Chernobyl did, but you're definitely going to have nuclear material on the ground. And that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And that is going to cause a problem. And this is the same issue that you see when there's talk about using nuclear reactors to fuel spaceships or to fuel rockets, because the same thing is true. We do not have a 100% liftoff record when it comes to rockets.
Well, and this was, of course, one of the problems with Project A119 when the American government was thinking of nuking the moon. Other people pointed out, if that rocket doesn't go well, we have just created a significant problem for ourselves.
Well, I mean, we weren't really thinking about all the problems when we were in the Cold War. We were just thinking about beating the Soviets.
You got to beat the Soviets. None of the radical B-36 fixes went anywhere. The plane was simply too large, slow, and vulnerable a target. After this, for a brief window of time, both the Americans and the Soviets decided that speed was the answer to ensuring the bomber would get through. As a result, there were several extremely fast bombers developed, some which went into service and some which did not. The Americans produced the B-58, a tricky hot rod of a bomber that was capable of Mach 2 sprints. However, because of its smaller size, it didn't have the range necessary to make it to Moscow without aerial refueling, and it didn't carry a large payload. The Americans also designed the enormous B-70, an extraordinary experimental plane which had a top speed of Mach 3 and was designed to use its folding wingtips to help ride the shockwave it produced as it hurtled through the atmosphere. However, just as we saw earlier with the Vickers Valiant, despite the velocity both planes could summon, by 1960 the upper atmosphere would no longer be a safe place for a bomber to fly, thanks to improved surface-to-air missiles. In addition, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles provided a way to deliver nuclear warheads into cities without the chance of interception. The age of the high-speed, high-altitude bomber came and went quickly. The B-58 would have a short service life, and the B-70 was cancelled entirely as a weapons program. But neither of these bombers comes in at number 2 on our list. Instead, it's a Soviet version of the high-speed bomber that takes that honor, because unlike the 2 American speedsters, this Soviet version was flawed in conception and execution. The Mishishev Design Bureau had already produced the M4 jet bomber, NATO codename Bison, in the 1950s. However, the M4 lacked the range to make a return mission to most U.S. cities and back, and lacked the speed to survive against modern jet interceptors. The M50 was the attempted answer to both of those problems, and it looked like something out of a futuristic cartoon. It was a large aircraft, about twice as long as the B-58. The Soviet bomber had to be big because of a significant geographical disadvantage of the Soviet Union. The Americans could station their bombers in Europe in order to get closer to Moscow. But before the Cuban Revolution, the Soviet Union had no allied nations from which to launch an attack on American cities. As a result, Soviet bombers needed to have greater range than their American counterparts. When the M50, codenamed Bounder by NATO, showed up in public at the 1961 Tushino Air Show, the West was shook. It was big. It was loud. It was weird-looking. But, as it would turn out, there were many fatal flaws that the aircraft possessed. For one, and this is a common problem for many military aircraft at the time, there were engine issues. It had been designed to have afterburning engines to provide more powerful takeoffs and bombing runs, but those engines were unavailable at first. Instead, it received 4 non-afterburning engines, which limited the maximum power considerably. The original specs predicted a top speed of Mach 1.8, but the M50 couldn't break the sound barrier when it was first built. Of course, engines can be improved or replaced, but the body shape of the plane itself limited its potential velocity as well. The fuselage was basically a cylinder. At first glance, that appears to be an ideal aerodynamic shape to punch through the air. However, engineers had learned by the mid-50s that in order to punch an aircraft through the sound barrier, you needed to apply something called the area rule. A cylindrical shape might work for bullets, but that's only because bullets don't have wings. The increased air displacement that occurs over an aircraft's wings requires the body of the aircraft to cinch in at the waist like a wasp in order to allow for easier airflow. The M50 hadn't done this, and because the fuel for the plane was stored in the fuselage rather than the wings, any reduction in the width of the body would have also resulted in a reduced operational range. The engine location was also a problem. 2 of the 4 engines were located at the very tips of the wings. This meant that the thrust was created far from the center of the aircraft, so any loss of power in one engine would have exaggerated effects on the direction of flight and a catastrophic effect on the flyability of the aircraft. And since the engines were underpowered and slow to respond anyway, the crew would probably not be able to adjust in time to prevent a crash. The M50 was such an odd-looking aircraft that when the CIA received spy plane photographs of it in 1958, they considered the possibility that it was going to have a nuclear power plant, since the length of the fuselage ahead of the wings made no sense for a conventionally fueled bomber. Although in the same memo they point out that there was no evidence connecting the M50 to any sort of nuclear power plant testing. Looking back from the future, we now know that there was never any plan to turn the M50 into a nuclear-powered aircraft. It was simply poorly designed. But the M50 did have one significant advantage over the number 1 entry on our list. The M50 never went into service, so no crews were required to fly it regularly. That, unfortunately, is not true of the Tupolev Tu-22, which is part of the reason it lands at the number 1 spot. To be honest, I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. In the last few decades, the Tu-22 has become infamous for its terribleness. However, it's worthwhile to examine that terribleness to separate some of the myths from the facts of the plane that NATO designated as the blinder. The Tu-22 was a medium bomber designed for specific purposes: nuclear strikes on Europe and attacks on American aircraft carriers. As discussed earlier, the Soviet Union didn't have any forward bases that could be used to attack America, and so the Tu-22 couldn't have reached any American cities other than Alaskan ones. This limited its effectiveness, but if it had been a quality aircraft, it could have still performed a useful, if horrifying and destructive, task if the Cold War had turned hot. However, despite looking like something out of Jerry Anderson's Thunderbirds, the Tu-22 was obviously not a quality aircraft. Andrei Tupolev himself referred to the 22 as one of his less fortunate creations, an opinion largely shared by the ground crew and air crew that were assigned to it. Many of the issues stemmed from the location of the engines, above the fuselage at the rear of the plane. This meant that the thrust line was above the center of the plane's gravity, so increasing thrust also pushed the nose down, and reducing thrust caused the plane to pitch up. The controls were extremely heavy, to the point that after a couple of flights in one day, a pilot would be too exhausted from the physical strain to fly again. This meant landings were an exercise in ridiculousness and terror, made even worse by high landing speeds and the terrible ergonomics in the cockpit. There was a crew of 3 with a single pilot who was sitting slightly to the left. This meant that when there was a crosswind and the plane had to land slightly crabbed to one side, the pilot was unable to see forward through the heavily framed canopy. This was made worse by the fact that many of the controls couldn't be reached from the pilot's seat, to the degree that many pilots had elaborate systems of strings and hooks to try to reach the necessary switches and levers. And the ejection seats fired downwards, which must have been top of mind to the crew every time they tried to land. The armaments didn't do the Tu-22 crews any favors either. The Kh-22 missile was particularly unpleasant to work with. The fumes from its toxic oxidant were so potent that ground crews had to wear full protective suits with masks to avoid injury or death. 2 of the reconnaissance versions of the Tu-22 were destroyed when the flash bombs in their bomb bays, which were used to illuminate an area for night photography, went off and illuminated the inside of the bomb bay instead. By 1975, 70 of the Tu-22s had been lost in accidents, about 20% of all aircraft, and sadly, many crew members were lost in these accidents as well. Once it became clear that few bombers would be able to survive against a properly equipped enemy if they tried to drop free-fall conventional bombs, the Tu-22 was converted to a missile carrier, or teketanosets in Russian. However, many Tu-22 crews referred to it instead as a spiritonosets, or booze carrier. Each Tu-22 needed to carry about 450 liters of a 40-60 mix of grain alcohol and distilled water for hydraulic and de-icing systems. But many liters of that alcohol instead went into crew members to help them deal with the many irritants and dangers of flying in a Tu-22. The designers of these aircraft were being asked to do something difficult on many levels: engineer a plane that could effectively and reliably bring about the end of the world in an age in which the ground on which they stood was constantly moving due to technological advances and doctrinal changes. Some of the Soviet engineers were working with the fear of the Gulag hanging over their heads like an icy sword of Damocles, and everyone was working with mushroom clouds dancing in their nightmares. The crews that had to maintain and fly these planes were doing so knowing that at any time the drills and practices could turn into actual war, and they would be sent off to do something unthinkable in machines that were often as much a threat to themselves as to their targets. We should be thankful that none of these bombers fulfilled their ultimate purpose of delivering nuclear Armageddon, and hopeful that someday human ingenuity and cleverness can be put to a less destructive end.